Hello students. Today I'm going to speak about this topic called gender and law. This is offered in the course called BGS 011 and this is a part of the CGSL program and the BAGS program. Now the CGSL, you must be thinking what? It's a certificate in gender and law, and the BA in gender gender studies program, which is offered by School of Gender and Development Studies. Now let me raise this question that why we need to study gender and law. Now this is something which is a very significant to get into this debate, to understand or to unfold this whole debate on gender and law. You might be thinking that why this question I'm raising. I think one of the important area which we need to understand is the category of gender. Now, gender is a word particularly mentioned in 1950s by some American scholars, and the ways in which that it unfolded, because gender is a category which has multiple meanings also over a period of time. And if you look at then finally one would also understand that why we need to get into this debate called of gender. Now historically, if we look at the category of the gender, one would see that the ways in which for instance, the ethnographers, the anthropologists, then the psychologists, and eventually the sociologists, they are the one who were, started building up this debate. And you would see that, for instance, the large number of the debate in 50s onwards which emerged, and one of the scholar I want to just quote is the Gail Rubel's work. Like the ways in which that, if you sort of read the work of Gail Rubin, you would understand the ways in which that, she is pointing out through the figures that how this discourse was unfolded, or the ways in which that one has to sort of engage with it. Now, when we talk about gender, patriarchy is something which we need to tease out very carefully, and to understand the patriarchy and its formation, one has to go back and look at the very interesting work of Lerner's work. Like for instance, it's one of the fascinating work. I would request you to read The Creation of the Patriarchy. She's drawing, in fact, Lerner is drawing from this book, and what she did is that she sort of engaged with the Mesopotamian civilization. And by studying that, she is trying to, bring out this very interesting debate that we need to also understand through civilization process, that how patriarchy was operating. To counter that also, one has to also look at the debate of Friedrich Engels. He wrote very interesting book about the family and the private property, and where you would see that the agrarian society in which that the woman was given a prime importance, or a prime figure was woman. And then eventually how, the civilization process, happened, and how, the roles also were changed, right? We need to also, develop and acknowledge the need of the gendered critique of the discourse, legal discourse in India. Now, you might be wondering that why I'm making this statement. I think that if we look at internationally, cutting across the world, these debates are there. Like, for instance, if we look at the debates on United Nations currently, because recently we experience and at international level the wars, the war crimes, the ways in which the refugee issues unfolded. Look at the migration issue, look at the issues of the displacement, the floods, the natural calamities, in which that the prime role which one has to also see it's as a human being, that how it is affecting to every citizen. Now, these are something which are the man-made, these are something, some of the natural calamities. But one has to also understand from, human rights perspective. Now, these debates were already there at the international level, and then eventually we can see that in Indian context, many scholars, the legal scholars, especially the feminists, started intervening into it. Like, for instance, if we look at the path-breaking work of Indira Jaising and the others, they argued that it's not, the gender issue is not something that which we need to only see in the isolation. We also have to see these debates from the human rights perspective. And which is, I think, that much valid also when they talked about this way back. Now, I think that we need to build up the critique of, the gender critique of the legal discourse, because we also need to understand this, that the laws were there, because if we look at again the historically the ways in which that who ruled our countries, and lastly when the Britishers or the colonizers we call it, when they ruled it, the ways in which the laws were, the place, and most of those laws were very patriarchal, or we call it draconian laws. One of the best example is that when we look at the, the debate on repealing of the 377, right? I mean, look at that. For instance, that if you want to really get into more debate and to understand, I would recommend you the very fascinating book written by Sylvia Bowlby called Theorizing Patriarchy, in which that she's sort of, trying to make us understand the British laws which were there and how the patriarchy was operating through that, also in some of the sections which are mentioning in her book, right? So in a similar way, when we tease out, the laws in relation in the Indian context, that too particularly when we relate with the gender. Now, as I mentioned to you, the gender as a category, and woman is again been a prime factor, one has to also sort of engage with that. We need to not only look into the debate which is, woman-centric, but also to focus on the other genders, right? And therefore, I think that we need to also understand this, that the legal discourse we need to understand, and also we need to offer a sort of critique to that. Now, there are many aspects, for instance, many aspects of the gender and law which is there, which we need to investigate by engaging with the foundation of the core themes, right, when one is talking about the gender and law. And through this engagement, an effort is to made to elaborate the gendered understanding of law. Because see, law is again been seen in the isolation. For instance, if we look at the debate, I mean, for, of the whole discourse of the legal system, not only in the Indian context, but if, for instance, if we want to get back to this debate and look at the Western philosophy, for instance, the debates Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau and the others formulated, and the whole idea of the, the political, which emerged from the West and how feminists responded to that. One has to also see that from liberal, socialist, Marxist, radical feminists, the ways in which that we sort of interrogated those ideas and came to the conclusion that yes, we need to focus on the those debates and the knowledge production to sort of engage with it, to focus and to tease out and then dismantle and build up the new ideas over those debates. And I think that one of the ways in which we can engage with this debate is that how we should understand the debate of the law also, because we know that the lack of knowledge about law accelerate the vulnerabilities of the woman and the marginal categories. Now, for instance, if we look at Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau and the ways in which they are formulating the debates on the rights, right? But then we also need to understand that in the Western philosophy, when the liberalism emerged. I mean, we all know about this debates of the industrialization, post-industrialization debate, the debates on French Revolution and other, revolutions. But how we then sort of engage with this, right? So law is one of the ways in which that the feminists were demanding from the very beginning, and one of the best example which one can cite is, the liberal feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, when she wrote the book Vindication of Rights of Women, where she's drawing our attention to particularly that how do we, sort of engage with the demands. For instance, the voting rights, it might be that as places in which that the public places can be claimed by the woman, right? Not only the right to vote, but right to education, because one of the ways in which we can engage is the education, and then that, this domain, public versus private domain, which was always been there, but then how we negotiate with that, right? And when I'm making this statement that lack of knowledge about the law, I think one of the ways in which we can engage, particularly for instance in Indian context, like, if domestic violence had happened, how many of us knows that we need to approach to the police station? I mean, now the online facility of the FIR is available, but how do you launch the FIR? Do you know what sections can be revealed? How you write the first information report? How do you approach the police station? I mean, that the whole idea is that we do not know, and therefore that many cases, and you would see that the women are not able to go and report when the violence against women is happening. And I'm mentioning here the public, the private spheres, particularly the domestic violence, right? And I think therefore it's very, very important, because, and therefore then you would see that which category of these women are getting into these kind of violence. I think that if we go by the statistics also, one would see that, there's nothing called certainly one would claim that, right? A certain class of women are facing, because we would see also that there's also been a hierarchy within the categories of women based on the class, caste, gender, and one would see that the marginal woman, the marginal categories women, the minority women, they do face more problems. Now the feminists time and again, raised this question in the pre-independence period. Like for instance, if we look at that in the pre-independence period, the feminists in fact raised this question very particularly, that laws should be there, and during that time even they approached the British court. And one of the argument which I think that we need to also understand, the laws have been challenged time and again, because the ways in which now the category of woman particularly, going through diverse forms of the violence, like for instance the sati abolition. Now sati was something which we all of us knows that which was there, and the ways in which that our social reformers engage with that, right? At the same time, child marriage was there, Widow Remarriage Act. So lot of social reformers in fact engaged with that debate, and the debate starts with again that how do we focus on those areas. Now you would see the variation between these debates. If you go to Bengal, you will see that in the Bengali traditional ways in which that, for instance, the Tanika Sarkar's work, if we look at. Now Tanika Sarkar's argument is that when she talked about Bengali widow woman, she says certainly that it brought the changes, and you would see that over a period of time, when the act came into existence, eventually even after post-independence, you would see the status of the Bengali women, of course, eventually change. Now, therefore, that, we need to understand the interlinkages between the gender and law. I mean, we know that large number of the social sciences 3-4 decades before also was very patriarchal, and even today also to some extent in some places you would see that there is a patriarchal discourse which is a predominant or dominating even today. So we need to also understand that how do we locate gender and law and the interlinkages between gender and law and the social spaces and the other genders, because if we see that the other genders are merely treated as a commodity. Now when I'm saying this particularly, I mean to say that the LGBTQ question which was there, right, like for instance that in 90s onwards, when we see the phase of the globalization and recently we see the post-globalization period, you have to also understand that at international level, this debate slowly, shifted from 60s, 70s, from US to other Western parts of the world. And eventually you will see that how, it is sort of entering into Indian discourse and what kind of question the LGBTQ people are raising in India also. One of the example just I want to cite, to make you understand is the debate 2-3 years before when Justice Chandrachud was there about the equality marriage. Now, there are a lot of debate which one can, sort of engage with it. But one of the prime concern again was that in the whole debate is right to property, right to inheritance, right to marriage. So these debates again are, unfolding and making us to rethink, right? How do you place it? What is the norms? What are the norms and how do we, engage with that, and how the society is going to go and accept those debates, or, is the society's mindset we are going to change it or not? That is something which we have to question it, right? Now, the basic understanding of the legal system, which is very necessary, like for instance, when we talk about gender and law, we need to know is that the basic legal understanding, because when we offered this course, particularly for the certificate program, we thought that 10+2 is a qualification and our students should be able to understand what is a basic understanding of the legal system in India. What is law? There are different sort of definition which one can engage with it, but one of the prime concern is law is for whom? Why laws are created in the society? Why we made laws? The laws are there that because we want something, a rule, right? A discipline, which one can say. Discipline in the sense that the rules and the discipline in the sense because we want to regulate a society which should be a very peaceful society, no chaos should be there. So when we engage with this again, the debate, laws are for whom? One would see that the laws are on demand, created by the people in the society. If you even look at historically from West to Indian context also, and you can sort of engage with this debate very easily when you look at these debates on for say the group rights versus the community rights, and for that you can sort of engage with the debates on multiculturalism, which Kimlika talked about, or the Gurpreet Mahajan talked about it. And one has to also see that how the legal system, which has a co-relationship again with the gender. Now, in order to understand this debate further, we need to know the various laws which are existing and the current debates about the laws related with women and other genders also. For instance, like when I'm talking about the various laws. Now, for instance, that take an example of again the Domestic Violence Act of 2005, right? Now, if you look at again the Domestic Violence Act emerged with a long battle where the feminist engagement was there. The women's movement contributed so much to each law. Like for instance, if you look at the fascinating work, The Scandal of the State, which is there, and you would see that Rangarajan is talking about this debate of when she wrote this debate, because the state again is a prime factor, because feminists tend to sort of engage with the state, but they said that we are not happy with the state. And if you look at the works by, say, Janki Nair, Tanika Sarkar, and others also, the feminist historians also for that, you would analyze that these debates, they, sort of engage from the colonial period till now, and raising this question that the laws are there, but they are very much in patriarchal nature. When the violence was increased, it's day by day increasing, the feminists felt that it's very important that to, sort of do the lobbying and to engage with this and take it forward to the state, whatever government may be possibly, and to make them think about that we required a new laws, and therefore that the Domestic Violence Act of 2005, which emerged in that way. In a similar way, we can see that the Dowry Act, when 80s, 90s in India was, having a large number of cases. And even today, if you look at the social media, or if you are listening the news through, the TV channels and all, you would see that recently that the dowry cases are triggering. Now, having laws also, why is it so happening? We need to question also that, because laws are there, laws can be implemented, but what is going wrong with the society? Even having laws, why still dowry? Because 80s, 90s, you would again see that, the Sati Abolition Act was already there. Raja Ram Mohan Roy took lot of efforts, and later on you would see that post-independence also we do have the dowry, and the Dowry Act emerge again. But then you have to also understand that why again the dowry cases are, surfacing. At the same time, the Sati, as I mentioned, in the context of the Sati, the acts very much, but then still we have a Roop Kaur's case, which had happened in 80s. In a similar way, one has to also see the rape laws, how it unfolded. If we remember a very famous letter written by the four eminent people, Upendra Bakshi, Vasudha Dhagambar, Uma Chakravarti and others, you would see that it was a rape case, Tukaram versus State of Maharashtra. Initially, we used to call it, Mathura rape case, but then feminists also, over a period of time, started engaging with the language, and they said, no, we need to change the language also why we are putting, because this was a first custodial rape, which was reported in, Chandrapur district, and then how again the rape laws changed, because the most latestly we saw that in 2012, the Nirbhaya case, in which we sort of engage with this debate of gender and law and how the laws are unfolded. I mean, there are a number of laws, like for instance, again, surrogacy is one of them, to make you understand that how it has accepted eventually. The first surrogate mother was from Chennai, and again this debate of purity, impurity, which was again engaging into this, and you would see that how those case studies in fact reflect and made us think that do we need to, and today it's a booming market. I mean, we know about it very categorically, the ways in which, in some parts of India, for instance, Gujarat, that the surrogacy is something which, again, how we engage with this, and then, the prime focus and the guidelines which have been given by the government, and then Act came into existence. Now, I was citing also the example of the Transgender Act of 2019. Now, when we look at that, there's always been a struggle of the feminists, the women's movement, the LGBTQ community, the minority, and you would see that eventually that the positive steps have been taken by the state, because state is not something every time very friendly on the gender discourse. The state, and therefore one has to also understand that many scholars like Catherine McKinnon and others who talked about it, that how do we go about it. Now, going back to the prime question on the gender, like for instance, when we study gender, we also look at these binaries of the sex and gender. Now, which is something which is in relation with the biological character and which is in relation with the social construction of the everyday, how we formulate the gender categories and how we see in the everyday discourse category of the gender. But then the binaries again were challenged by people like Judith Butler. If you read her book, very interesting book, Gender Trouble, right? Now this discourse again further taken forward by other scholars parallelly. You can read that. The Foucault's work, and you can draw. Of course, Butler is drawing from Foucault, but then you need to also understand that these are not something limited. The feminists like Judith Butler offered a criticism to this whole discourse that no, these are the the fixed categories, which was something old categories, but we need to see from a fresh perspective. And if we look at the work of the Michel Foucault's work, and also the old work of Sigmund Freud in relation to the psychoanalysis and the debate on gender and sexuality, one can sort of draw our attention that how one has to get into this debate, particularly from medical sciences, but then legal discourse, and many more branches we can open up to understand this debate. And one has to in fact then evaluate the existing laws. Like for instance, when I'm focusing on Transgender Act, now it is a practice that many of the laws and many of the things have been placed in a public domain to get the opinion by the government of India, which is fantastic. But at a time, sometime we tend to have the tendency that according to time we need to also change. So for instance, there is a categorically the debate has to be taken forward that how do we look at, for instance, the rape laws in relation to the transgender woman. Now we need to open up this debate to understand what are the existing laws, how do you evaluate, and how newly amended and acted laws in the context of gender and justice. So one has to sort of engage with this sexuality debate, identity, marginalization, patriarchy specifically, LGBTQ plus people, and so on. And therefore that the critique is necessary, that how do you formulated the premises of the patriarchy which is existing in all those laws. We have a number of case laws which we can sort of engage and tease out. One of the prime factor I just wanted to mention when one is talking about the law, gender and law, is the something we need to understand after post-independence, the Hindu Code Bill, right? Or the personal laws, or the Uniform Civil Code Bill. Now, these are something which are again been very primarily focusing again and again, and latestly that I was reading one very interesting article which is talking about that is the tribal woman falls under the category of Hindu laws or not. So we need to also understand the contribution of the women's movement, how it has challenged the patriarchal institution, so on and so forth, and the ways in which that we can sort of engage with the marginal communities, people, and we need to recognize it, and how time and again the Constitution of India deployed the laws to challenge the patriarchy which is inherent in the laws. So thank you very much.